You know that moment when you realize your neighborhood has officially lost its mind? Yeah, that was me, standing in my front yard, holding a tape measure, while 3 HOA board members argued over whether my fence was 1 inch too tall. I remember thinking, wow, this is how grown adults spend their weekends fighting over wood. Height. It all started when I decided to build a fence for privacy. Not to block the sun, not to build a castle, just to keep my dog from running into my neighbor's flower obsession. I followed every single rule in that ridiculous HOA handbook, which, by the way, is thicker than a Harry Potter novel, and built my fence exactly 6 feet tall. But apparently, 6 feet is too intimidating. That is what Karen, yes, her name was actually Karen, said during the HOA inspection. She stood there with her measuring stick like she was surveying NASA's next rocket launch and said, according to Section 9B, fences cannot exceed 5 feet and 11 inches. I blinked. You are joking, right? She said. No, the extra inch disrupts the aesthetic harmony of the community. The aesthetic harmony? Lady, your husband has a 10-foot plastic Santa on the lawn all year round. But fine. I did what any good citizen would do. I smiled, nodded, and waited for them to leave. Then I looked at my fence, took a deep breath, and thought, challenge accepted. The next weekend, I adjusted my fence. Not down. Oh no, up. If they said it was too tall, then I was going to make sure it deserved that title. So I went to the hardware store, bought more lumber, and built the most unnecessarily dramatic fence this neighborhood had ever seen. I'm talking 8 feet tall, perfectly straight, solid oak. It looked like something guarding a medieval castle. I even painted it royal brown, just to make it extra offensive to HOA eyes. The day after I finished, I was sitting in my backyard with a cold drink, admiring my masterpiece, when I heard it, the sound of HOA heels approaching. Tap, tap, tap. Karen appeared again, clutching her clipboard like it was a holy relic. Sir, your fence is clearly in violation of HOA policy. I said, yes, ma'am. It was too tall before, right? She squinted at me. Yes, I smiled. Well, now it is way too tall. You were right. She did not find that funny. She started scribbling on her clipboard like she was writing a police report for a fence-related crime. Next day, I got the letter. Immediate removal required. Non-compliance will result in fines. So naturally, I framed it, hung it right on my 8-foot fence like a trophy. Then, something magical happened. My neighbors started noticing. The guy across the street came over and said, man, your fence is legendary. The lady 2 houses down whispered, we hate the HOA too. Suddenly, my fence became a symbol of freedom. People started calling it the Wall of Independence. Someone even drew a little American flag on it in chalk. Of course, HOA did not find the patriotism charming. They called an emergency board meeting. Imagine 5 adults sitting around a table, panicking over a fence. His fence sets a dangerous precedent. Other residents might copy him. Property values will drop. Meanwhile, I am at home roasting marshmallows by my illegal fence, enjoying life. Then came the big moment. HOA sent an official letter threatening legal action. You could tell they were serious this time. They even used bold font. So, I decided to make things interesting. I wrote back, politely, of course, and said, thank you for your letter. I will absolutely lower the fence. However, I am hiring a professional architect to ensure proper symmetry and community alignment. 2 weeks later, the HOA came back to check progress. And what did they see? A brand new design, a second, smaller fence built on top of the first one, double layered with fairy lights. Karen's face turned a new shade of red I did not know existed. What is this? She yelled. I smiled and said, aesthetic harmony. 2 fences, balanced, symmetrical, perfectly aligned. She looked like she was about to faint. At that point, even the mailman was laughing every morning when he walked by. The entire street had turned into my audience. People were taking pictures. Someone posted it online. Man fights HOA with fence tower, and it went viral. Of course, eventually, they stopped fighting. I think they realized that every time they sent a new letter, my fence got taller and the internet got louder. By the end of the month, the HOA quietly updated the rulebook, fence height recommendations, to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. In other words, they gave up. Now my fence stands proudly. 8 feet tall, unbothered, legendary. And every time Karen walks by, she looks the other way. So, yeah, they said my fence was too tall. So I went higher. After my fence went viral, I thought the drama was over. Spoiler alert, It was only the intermission. See, the HOA does not like losing. They are like that one ex who just cannot accept you have moved on. So, while I was busy grilling burgers in my backyard, behind my glorious 8-foot monument, they were busy plotting. It started small. One morning, I noticed a letter taped to my mailbox. Routine property inspection scheduled. Now, if you are new to HOA life, routine inspection means we are mad and we are coming for revenge. So that weekend, I was sitting outside when I saw it, a little drone hovering over my house. A drone. I almost spit out my coffee. These people actually launched aerial surveillance because of a fence. I waved at it, smiled, then shouted, "Hey, make sure you get my good side." Next day, another letter. Unapproved decorative lights observed on the upper structure of your fence. Upper structure. They were talking about the fairy lights. Apparently, lights are allowed on trees, but not on rebellious fences. So, naturally, I upgraded. I bought solar-powered rainbow lights that twinkled at night and set them to party mode. My fence now looked like a nightclub entrance. The neighbors loved it. The HOA, not so much. Karen came storming over again, holding her clipboard like a medieval weapon. She said, "Sir, this is unacceptable. The lights are distracting." I said, "Distracting? Karen, they are solar-powered. I am saving the planet." She was not amused. She scribbled furiously, muttering something about visual pollution. Visual pollution from rainbow lights. Meanwhile, her yard gnome army glowed in the dark like radioactive mushrooms. Anyway, a few days later, the HOA president himself decided to step in. His name was Greg, a man who looked like he had been born wearing a Bluetooth headset. Greg called me to discuss my violations, so I invited him over for coffee. He showed up in a suit for a backyard visit. I was in flip-flops holding a mug that said "World's Tallest Fence Owner." He started, "Mr. Daniels, the HOA strives to maintain visual consistency within the neighborhood. Your fence stands out." I said, "Thank you. I worked hard on that." He blinked. That was not a compliment. I smiled, felt like one. Then he pulled out a binder. According to Section 11C, modifications exceeding community height limits require formal approval. I leaned back, sipped my coffee, and said, "Greg, your house has a flagpole taller than my fence." He froze. "That is different." We said, "That is patriotic." I said, "Exactly. So is freedom from nosy neighbors." Greg's expression did a full Windows error screen. He sighed, packed his binder, and said, "You will hear from us soon." Sure enough, a week later, I got a fine, $500, for nonconformity. Now, most people would be mad. I laughed so hard, I almost framed that too. But then I had a better idea. Instead of paying the fine, I decided to match it in fence upgrades. I called my friend Jake, who is a carpenter with a dangerous sense of humor. I told him, we are making history. That weekend, we extended the fence again, but this time, we got creative. We added a small observation deck on top, like a mini balcony, with a single chair, and a flag that said, "Fence Level Expert." When I climbed up there for the first time, I could literally see the entire neighborhood. It was glorious. By Monday morning, the HOA was in panic mode. Karen was pacing outside like a detective in a crime drama. Greg showed up again, this time with 2 other board members, taking pictures like it was a crime scene. "Sir," Greg said, "you cannot build an elevated platform. That is considered a secondary structure." I grinned. "Actually, Greg, it is a decorative extension. Check your Section 8A. It says, I am allowed reasonable, decorative elements." He froze. "That is not reasonable." I said, "Depends on your sense of humor," Karen mumbled. "We will be reporting this to the county." "Oh, perfect," I said. I love visitors. 2 days later, a county inspector really did come by. He looked at the fence, looked at the HOA people, then looked at me. He said, "Is this thing safe?" I said, "Absolutely. Built to code." He walked around, checked it, nodded, and said, "Well, nothing illegal here, just unusual." Karen's jaw dropped. "Unusual. That is it," he shrugged. "Not against the rules." Then he looked at me and whispered, "Honestly, this is hilarious. Nice job." After that day, something shifted. The HOA started avoiding my street entirely. I think they realized that every time they poked me, I came back with a bigger, funnier version of revenge. Even local news caught wind of it. A small paper did a story titled "Man Outsmarts HOA with Humor and Lumber." Suddenly, people from other neighborhoods were driving by just to see the fence. One lady stopped her car and said, "You are a hero, man. My HOA fined me for having pink flamingos." I said, Put him on a fence next time. But the best part, Greg eventually resigned. Yep, Mr. Bluetooth himself quit. I like to imagine it was because every time he closed his eyes, he saw my fence in his nightmares. Now, HOA meetings are quieter. Karen still waves sometimes, with one finger missing, if you know what I mean. But mostly, peace has returned. And me. I sit on my observation deck every evening with a cup of tea, watching the sunset, knowing that I achieved something no one thought possible. Freedom through fence construction. If you ask me, that is the American dream right there. So the next time someone tells you your fence is too tall, just smile and say, not yet. You would think after my fence of freedom went viral, the HOA would finally chill out, right? Wrong. Apparently, losing in public triggered something deep inside them, like a midlife crisis powered by paperwork. They came back with a new strategy, rule reinvention. One morning, I found another thick envelope in my mailbox. The cover said, HOA policy revision, immediate action required. Inside, it read, any structure exceeding 6 feet must be registered as a visual obstruction, requiring a special variance form approved by the board. Translation: we wrote a rule just for you, fence man. I actually laughed out loud. My fence had made such an impact, they changed the law of the land. Congratulations, HOA. You just admitted defeat in 12-point Times New Roman. Still, I knew better than to ignore it. These people were serious. So, I decided to play their game my way. I went online, downloaded their shiny new form, printed it, and under purpose of structure, I wrote art installation, symbol of freedom, privacy, and the American dream. Then, under estimated height, I wrote yes. When they called me for clarification, I told them, it is not a fence anymore, Greg. It is performance art. There was silence on the phone for a good 10 seconds. Then he said, sir, you cannot just call your fence art. I said, why not? Art is subjective. He hung up. 2 weeks later, they tried to outsmart me. They called a neighborhood vote, something dramatic like, should we limit artistic structures in backyards? But the best part, half the neighborhood sided with me. Turns out, after all my battles, people were secretly rooting for me. My fence had become a local legend. Folks who had never attended a single meeting were suddenly voting like it was the presidential election. And when the results came in, it was a tie. Now, according to HOA rules, a tie means the issue must be postponed for further review, which is HOA code for we give up for now. That night, I celebrated by hanging a new sign on the fence that said, exhibit closed for renovation. The next morning, Karen nearly tripped over her own clipboard trying to read it. From that day onward, I decided to fully lean into the artist identity. If they were going to treat me like an outlaw, I might as well be a fancy one. So, I ordered a metal plaque online that read, The Freedom Fence, a modern statement on bureaucracy. Installed it right in the middle of the wood. Then, for extra flair, I added little wind chimes made from recycled soda cans. They jingled every time the wind blew. It sounded like pure rebellion. Of course, HOA lost its mind again. Greg called me, trying his best to sound calm. Mr. Daniels, this is not funny anymore. I said, you are right, Greg. It is hilarious. He sighed. Do you understand how disruptive you have been to this community? I said, disruptive. Greg, I have never seen more people smiling during their morning walks. He said, you are undermining authority. I said, exactly. There was that silence again, the sound of a man questioning his entire career choice. A week later, I got invited to the next HOA meeting, not as a punishment, but as a guest speaker. Apparently, some of the newer board members found my approach innovative. I showed up in a t-shirt that said, Fence Lives Matter. When they gave me the floor, I stood up and said, ladies and gentlemen, the fence was never about height. It was about principle. It was about privacy, individuality, and the right to build something ridiculous without a committee vote. I could see half the room nodding. The other half looked like they wanted to call the police. Karen raised her hand. So, are you planning to take it down? I smiled. Absolutely not. But I will repaint it. And that is when my final act began. I hired a local artist, a guy named Marco, who painted murals around town, and told him, I want this fence to tell a story. He showed up with buckets of paint and created a masterpiece. Bright colors, bold lines, and right in the middle, a huge text that said, too tall for control. When it was done, people started visiting just to take photos. Kids loved it. Couples took selfies in front of it. Even the mailman gave me a thumbs up. Then, one morning, Greg himself walked by, looked at the mural, and for the first time ever, he smiled. He said, you know, It is actually kind of nice. I said, careful, Greg. That sounds like approval. He chuckled and said, let us just call it an exception. That was the moment I knew I had one. Not with fines, not with fights, but with laughter. A few months later, they rewrote the rules again, but this time, they included a new clause. Creative expression within community boundaries is encouraged, provided it maintains safety standards. That means fences, murals, decorations, all officially allowed. I had changed the HOA rulebook with humor. Now, every evening when I sit by my fence, watching the sunset bounce off those crazy bright colors, I feel a weird kind of pride, because it is not just a fence anymore. It is proof that sometimes the best way to fight nonsense is to outsmart it with a smile and a little paint. So yeah, they said my fence was too tall, but I went higher. And in the end, they built a rule that stood even taller, one called freedom.